Okay. Well, it is my immense pleasure to introduce the two speakers for our first afternoon session today. First, we will have Banu Subramaniam from Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at UMass Amherst. So Banu is a STS scholar with a background in biology, I believe. I believe you have a PhD in biology, which is interesting. And Banu has recently written a book called Ghost Stories for Darwin, which won the Ludwig Fleck Prize. And then second, we have Suman Seth, who teaches in the STS program at Cornell, and also has very recently published a book called Difference in Disease, Medicine, Race, and Locality in the 18th Century British Empire. So we'll start with Banu, who's going to talk to us about diaspora, and then Suman will talk to us about race.
Thanks, Lukas, and thanks to the organizers, Adi, Leela, Lukas, and Tim, and also the incomparable Kate and Trouder for their superb organization. So, the camera opens with an eerie, dusty, desolate street, bathed in the shimmering hues of a dusky evening. Rows of squat wooden buildings frame each side. The wind howls. The music plays the discordant notes of foreboding futures. And then the quintessential icon of the American West makes its appearance. A large brown mass of dried and tangled plant matter rattles down the street. The camera follows the rattling ball as it rolls and bounces on, seemingly endlessly, with strange precision, a purposeful gait, and an enlivened spirit. This scene is the classic archetype of the American West, and the hero, the rattling ball, is the floral icon, which is a diaspora, the classic tumbleweed. The rattling structure houses thousands of seeds that scatter about as the tumbleweed mass bounces along its path. It is worth noting that the tumbleweed, an icon of the American West, is not native to the US or even the Americas. Indeed, none of the quintessentially American icons, the cowboy and his accessories, the horse and cattle, are native. The tumbleweed is in fact Russian in origin, commonly called the Russian thistle, brought to the US by Russian religious refugees to South Dakota in the 1870s. Why and how, I began to wonder, do some objects come to be beloved and to inhabit the iconography of a nation? Tumbleweeds of the West, the cherry blossoms of DC, the Georgia peach, while other objects remain resolutely alien, foreign, and reviled, such as kudzu, the Asian carp, or zebra mussels. I selected the terms, which are really twin terms, diaspora and diaspora, not only because it highlights colonial political biogeographies, but because of the common roots and roots of the two words that remind us that nature and culture are always co-produced. There are no natures and cultures, only nature cultures. The political concept of diaspora helps trace the entangled histories of multi-species lives and travels of empire. Diaspora is an ancient word, and both diaspora and diaspora come from the same Greek verb, to scatter about or to disperse. Now, both terms in botany and in cultural studies have the same etymology. But what I want to do here today is to link them conceptually and to link them in an interdisciplinary mode of thinking. In theorizing the words of movement, mobility, and migration, I find the concept useful for several reasons. First, tracing diaspora quintessentially helps us theorize nature cultures. It transcends these binaries of the human and non-human worlds. Second, the word is increasingly connected to the ravages of colonialism and the consequences of globalization, two processes central to understanding the travels of human, non-human, and conceptual worlds. It links the geographies of the colonial and colonized worlds and the scales of the global and the local. Third, unlike terms like rhizome or rhizomatic networks that connote clonal plants that proliferate only through asexual means, diasporas invoke sexual and asexual propagation through processes of recombination, adaptation, and mutations. Diaspora do this through complex roots and roots. Fourth, the term diaspora is by definition always relational. linking migrating communities to the lands and ancestors they left behind, but never collapsing the two into some essentialized mythic past. Finally, while dispersing plants and populations are related to the originary population, diaspora allows us for more imaginative sexualities, the possibilities of miscegenation and cross-fertilization through a politics of assimilation, or of remaining resolutely uniquely distinct through a politics of isolation and separation. And here, the complex sociology of diasporas within post-colonial and ethnic studies, and within biology, the relationship of how foreign plants build soil communities. So the idea of communities and community buildings is common across these two very different disciplinary formations. So Diaspora opens up robust and imaginative landscapes to trace the entangled conceptual histories of multi-species lives and travels. People move, plants move, animals move. And I explore the field of invasive species management, arguing that we cannot understand how the field of invasion biology and allied practices and policies of conservation and restoration ecology without understanding the inextricable interconnections between nature and culture. In our quest to be modern and in our claims of modernity, we have vivisected a vibrant organic planet and dynamic knowledge systems into a narrow parochial and insular disciplinary formation. What has become obscured in our disciplinary silos is that plants, people, and ideas are inextricably entangled. To understand the co-constitution of these worlds, we need nature-cultural narrative practices and concepts. Diaspora is one such twin concept. Concepts migrate across disciplines from the sciences to the humanities and back, and are repurposed to theorize new objects in new contexts. Many terms like diaspora and diaspora span species and disciplines, from human contexts in ethnic and post-colonial studies to scientific and biological terminologies. For example, in addition to diaspora, native, alien, local, foreigner, colonizer, colonized, naturalized, pioneer, refugee, founder, resident, to name a few. Indeed, environmental historians have argued that rather than thinking of the impact of colonialism as something colonialism had on biology, ecology of the environment, it would be more accurate to think of imperialism as fundamentally an ecological project, in which humans, plants, and other species were shuffled across the earth in schemes for colonization and conservation. Colonialism was the original bio-invasion of mammoth proportions. In the early modern period, botany, for example, was big science and big business, critical to Europe's ambition as a colonial trader. Understanding the field of botany through such colonial historiography reminds us that it was never the pure story of rigorous and apolitical taxonomies, nomenclature, and systems of classification that I studied in my botany classes, but rather a science deeply entangled in colonial ambitions. Alongside this movement emerged foundational concepts in ecology, evolution, and other biological and human sciences. We've historically imagined our relationship with the biota of the world in numerous and diverse ways. In his influential book, Ecological Imperialism, Alfred Crosby argues that the roots of European modern domination of the Western world lie in their creating new Europes wherever they went, especially in North and South America, Australia, and New Zealand, where settler colonialism ravaged native populations of humans, plants, and animals. The colonists took with them a portmanteau of biota, plants, animals, and pathogens that enabled expansions of Europe and a radical transformation of the globe. Where Europeans went, their agriculture and animals went, as did their pathogens. They thrived while indigenous ecosystems collapsed. This vast migration of species ushered in a bio-invasion of mass proportions. Some plants were now ubiquitous not just in Europe, but across the globe. As Crosby remarks, the sun never set on the empire of the dandelion. The science of breeding and horticulture led to scientific breeding stations across the globe and turned raw materials from the colonies into plantation crops for British, French, and other colonies and empires, including the Americas. Indeed, it is more accurate to talk about our entire planet having been biotically reconfigured due to the long history of what Richard Grove calls green imperialism. Not only did colonial expansion usher in an unprecedented movement of people, plants, and animals, it also ushered in concerns about ecological destruction and degradation. Conservation biology thus has deep roots in imperialism, and with this green imperialism began a vision of Edenic islands that were being harmed through colonial extraction. This process allows us to understand a process that foregrounds the etymological definition of diaspora and diaspora, of how Europeans helped disperse and scatter plants, animals, and pathogens, and thus enable the expansion of Europe. At the same time, in their desire to recreate homes or little Europes in the colonies, they transported European biota to restructure the colonized landscapes, thus destabilizing our association of flora and fauna with natural or autochthonous landscapes. In a profound act of amnesia and irony, they now insist on preserving these new Europes from newer immigrants from Asia, South America, and Africa. The free and profligate movements of biota across the globe during colonialism reminds us of the hubris of empire, where colonists carried their landscapes with them, building European landscapes in their backyards and housing exotic items in homes and museums. In the United States in the late 19th and 20th century, the USDA had an active program that sent biologists as explorers across the globe to search for new and interesting economic and aesthetic plants. Dr. David Fairchild, for example, who was director of USDA's section of seed and plant introduction, is said to have personally introduced over 112,000 species and varieties into the US. Likewise, the American Acclimatization Society introduced varieties of plants and animals, including an attempt to introduce all the bird species mentioned in Shakespeare's works into New York City's Central Park in the 1890s. Such an open and laissez-faire US policy was indeed the norm until the late 19th century. The shift emerges in part because of what historians name as America's changing relationships with nature. In the US, the decades after the Civil War, industrialization, urbanization, and westward expansion transformed the nation's landscapes and redefined America's relationship with nature. And this new love of nature was evidenced in a dramatic rise in Americans who called themselves nature lovers. And so nature loving became the key characteristics of natives, and foreigners were seen as not loving nature. And so you see the beginning of the native emerging as that site of purity in our conceptions of human, plant, and animal ecologies. Natural and cultural worlds are always mediated not only through material bodies of living organisms, but also through discursive practices and language. Theories of natural history and the conceptual roots of much of botanical nomenclature and organization are rooted in colonial history. Carl Linnaeus and his binomial system of classification erased local knowledges and naming across the worlds that imposed really an abstract universal system of knowledge. And theories of natural history and the conceptual roots of much of botanical nomenclature and organization are rooted in this kind of colonial history. The colonial legacy of botany is immense and deep, and it starts with the very nomenclature of plants. And we can see how systems of sex, gender, and sexuality get imposed on plants, as does the language of race in science and medicine. So part of what Carl Linnaeus did and ushered in was a scientization of botany, and it was the same time, coincidentally, where there was an ardent sexualization of plants. Londa Shibinger shows how the scientific revolution and the revolution in sexuality and gender came together to elevate plant sexuality as a central focus of botany. Linnaeus gave primacy to plant sexuality that no other naturalist had attempted. As Janet Brown argues, to be a Linnaean taxonomist was to believe in the sex life of flowers. This male-dominated world sat squarely on a binary heterosexual worldview. Not only were his plants sexed, but they actually became human, specifically husbands and wives. He borrowed terms that referred to romance, eroticism, and the sanctity of love, nuptials, and marriage in his repertoire of vocabulary for plants. His renowned key to the sexual system is founded on the nuptiae plantarum, or the marriage of plants, based on their union and implicit heterosexuality, not their sexual dimorphism. As colonial expansion permeated the globe, Western systems of nomenclature supplanted local knowledges. As Jamaica Kincaid evocatively notes, this naming of things is so crucial to possession. a spiritual padlock with the key thrown irretrievably away, that it is a murder, an erasing. Colonial legacies have dismantled and erased a plethora of languages, local meaning-making practices and nomenclatures to usurp multiple cultures of knowing and replace them with the universal scientific monoculture of knowledge. As Kincaid laments, that this legacy of capturing and renaming nature leaves the post-colonial writer in the position of having to renegotiate the terms of taxonomy, struggling to articulate new relationships and new meanings in the tired language of empire. With the development of botany, its nomenclature, theories, and practices were constituted through the expansion of empire, and the conceptual landscapes of botany traveled to other sites. Nowhere are these colonial roots so evident as in the tracing the diasporic lives of plants, animals, and concepts. So what I want to do briefly is to trace this concept of diaspora and diaspora and the lives of diasporas and diasporas, and to do this as a quick arc of the history of invasion biology in the last 30 years. So the field of invasion biology emerges only in the 1990s, and it is fundamentally predicated on a discourse of nature in place and nature out of place. And by definition, invasive species are introduced species that do not belong. The idea of nature in place has a complex history, and the idea of nativeness is first introduced in 1835 by an English botanist called John Henslow, and the idea was to create a category of true British flora, and therefore in order to articulate true British flora, you had to articulate what was not true British flora. And so you get the classic familiar native alien binary. While the term continued to be used in the coming decades, no general policy about native and aliens emerged. It is only with growing nativism and policing of natural boundaries that we begin to see these distinctions. In the US, Philip Pauly notes that the paradigm of the nativist approach was the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, a year after the state's quarantine laws. After World War I, Congress introduced limitations on entries of all European immigration through the Immigration Act of 1924. Yet again, we see that human, plant, and animal histories are intertwined. Indeed, ideas of nativeness and closing borders emerge first with respect to plants and animals, before being given legal and institutional life in the management of people through states and its borders. So what I want to do now is to show you some snippets of what looking for alien and native plants in newspapers and magazines looks like. So this is a children's book on exotic invaders, and this is one of many children's books that have emerged. It seems that we can't start young enough in scaring children. Tinkering with Eden, again, a common theme that part of what invasion biology has done is replace an Edenic landscape with one with foreigners in it. America's battle with non-native animals and plants, again, sort of the language of wars and battle are very common in how one combats questions of foreign and invasive plants. And post 9/11, we see this language getting stronger. Weeds of a global garden. Again, the idea that a borderless world is the problem, that if we had clear borders and policed those borders, we would be in a better place. Here are some titles from newspapers and magazines. Alien invasion, they're mean, they're green, and they may be taking over a park or preserve near you. Wreaking havoc, creepy strangler climbs Oregon's least wanted list, alien threat. So what is striking in all of this, amongst many things, is the fact that not a single one of them mentions it's about plants or animals. It's all this classic fear of the foreign or outsider, and this is something you see repeatedly in newspapers and magazines. And so as I started looking across these stories, there were several characteristics that seemed common in how we talked about humans and how we talked about plants and animals. That they're all unhygienic, that foreigners are seen as alien, looking visibly foreign, they're taking over everything, they're stealth destroyers, they're indestructible, the classic third world woman as the oversexed female, that they're aggressive reproducers, They're causing irreversible change, and they're economically and ecologically destructive, and they've entered the country through unlawful and stealthy means. And my favorite title that sums this up is, they came, they bred, they conquered. Now, since 9/11, I noticed that this growing xenophobia was also accompanied by several very high-profile stories like the Chinese snakehead fish that got written up greatly. But there was also a lot of pushback. And so one begins to see stories that are pushing back against the xenophobia of the framing of invasive species. So there were some in 2011, several high-profile articles in newspapers talking about them, including this piece in Nature by biologist Mark Davis and his colleagues on Don't Judge Species on Their Origins. And so it's really important to note that within the biological literature, there are a lot of biologists who have pushed back on this language, as well as suggested alternate frameworks by which we can think about managing our ecological worlds. But part of why I think political concepts are important is the kind of ideological work the framing and platform of invasive species has done with funding. And so, for example, Davis and his colleagues say, classifying organisms by their adherence to cultural standards of belonging, citizenship, fair play, and morality does not advance our understanding of ecology, or that plants and animals, like humans, need a thoughtful and inclusive response. Diasporas and diasporas are caught up in analogous potent politics of xenophobia in the war of terror and invasion biology. Fundamentally, these debates are about the politics of nativism and national imaginations of who belongs and who does not. Understanding and tracing these disparate arguments and concepts in biology and the cultural worlds through a nature-cultural lens allows us to see the common conceptual terrain that diasporas and diasporas face through centuries of co-production. Diasporas and diasporas present us with a powerful and capacious concept that enables interdisciplinary and intersectional nature-cultural histories. It reveals the impoverished accounts of diasporas and diasporas that separate human and non-human worlds. It is the concept that reminds us that the hubris of empire and the irony of contemporary immigration politics when you see them side by side in a common history. And it gives us a way forward for our lives in the ruins. And so here is, just like Homeland Security, it tells us to watch our neighbors and report if there's something wrong. There are similar programs for, invasive plants, invasive insects. So here's an app that a colleague at UMass developed that, if you see something invasive, you can take a picture and send it to the local organization. And just as the call to arms across the border, we similarly see a call to arms in the name of environmentalism. And so you really see parallels in the last 20 years between cultural politics and the politics of the environment. The contradictions are everywhere. A foreign plant is an American icon. Edenic visions are mythic. The ontologically distinct zones of nature and culture are forever bound by theories and concepts. Our rigorous, rational, and supposed apolitical theories of nature are deeply entrenched in the histories of colonialism. Indeed, they are constitutive of colonialism and their attendant politics of race, class, gender, and sexuality. Nature is forever represented as female, and at least in the Western colonial imagination, an entity exploitable. Indeed, reading Western imaginations of the environment is like watching a spectacular dramatization of heterosexual teleology. The conceptual tools of nature cultures and diasporas and diaspora allow us to unravel the profound mobility and migration that colonialism has wrought. As a diasporic biologist now in the humanities, as a South Asian in the US, diasporas are also deeply personal. In her opening lines of her haunting poem, To the Diaspora, Gwendolyn Brooks writes, "You did not know you were Africa. When you set out for Africa, you did not know you were going because you did not know you were Africa. You did not know the Black continent that had to be reached was you." Brooks argues that in her search for Africa, she discovered that what she was seeking was always, all the time, right there within herself. I feel this deeply resonant. Trained as a biologist, I turned to the humanities to understand the politics of difference. As it turned out, the politics of difference was always deep within biology, in the very materiality of living organisms, in the vocabulary and concepts of the field. In understanding the links of diasporas and diasporas, I've come to discover the potent worlds of nature cultures. Indeed, the tumbleweed belongs in Eden, only because the mythic place of the Western imagination, Eden, is instead a place teeming with diversity and difference, attuned to the ravages of colonialism and slavery, and calibrated to histories in deep time. The tumbleweed in Eden rattles on and scatters along its way seeds for less ravaged futures. Thank you.
So let me add my thanks to Kit and Trouter, to Lukas and Adi and Tim, and particularly to my Didi Leela, who I've known for a very long time now. It's nice to be in an academic space as well as all our other spaces. I'm going to talk to you about race. I'm obviously not going to talk to you about most things to do with race. I actually feel the hubris of talking about this in this crowd. Anyway, it will largely be about race medicine. It will also largely be about Britain. Insert other throat-clearing excuses for why I'm not covering things I should be covering. So let me begin with a sketch of the debates around two of the related concepts that I'll talk about today, so race and race science. One of the most basic questions one can ask is when a history of race might properly begin. Indeed, those who study race have tended to divide themselves according to the question of whether it's legitimate to use the term prior to around, say, 1750 or not. Those who offer an expansivist definition note that observations concerning traits we now regard as quintessentially racialized, so skin color, for example, or hair type, have been made in almost every culture through history, and that one can find xenophobic remarks made against outsiders who were at least partly distinguished by appearance in works from the classical age onwards. Those who offer a more restrictive reading argue, by contrast, that observations about physical difference carried little weight compared to observations about, say, social or cultural differences. That is to say that physical differences made little difference. The real question was about whether one spoke Greek, for example, or later whether one was Christian or pagan, not skin colour or the presence or absence of facial hair. Nancy Steppen restricted her study of race science to the years 1800 to 1960, a period in which, as Hannah Augustine has lucidly noted, one may identify three rather novel and agreed upon tenets undergirding the science of race. First, that mankind or humankind could be divided into races, the characteristics of which were fixed or essentially fixed, so racial fixity. Second, that all human races did not possess the same intellectual and moral qualities, so racial inequality. And third, that intellect and character were determined, at least in part, by physical characteristics, a position that we could term racial determinism. So, clearly, 19th century race theory did not closely resemble earlier claims about race, even when the term came into existence around the 15th century. So that, to me at least, the debate over when a historian might begin a history of race comes to resemble that over the history of sexuality. One might identify forms of behaviour that we would regard as homosexual in the classical era, just as we may identify statements that sound racist. But these behaviours and these statements did not carry the meanings that we associate with them today. And in particular, before a period we might roughly call the modern age, neither sexuality nor race was seen as an essential category. So from that, it should be obvious, cards on the table, I do not believe that there were homosexuals in ancient Greece, and I do not think that it's terribly useful to talk about race or racism in that period either. But for that second answer about race, I have another political reason for leaning modern. And for that, it's worth thinking about the history of race, a field that has earlier antecedents, but the beginnings of which roughly coincide with the end of World War II. And in essence, much early history of race is an attempt to understand the Holocaust and other racially motivated horrors and genocides of the 20th century. How did the murder of 6 million Jews become thinkable? What was new about the modes of thought that led to barbarity on that scale? Unsurprisingly, particular focus was placed on notions of race, and within that concept then, a laser-like focus on racial fixity. If races aren't fixed, one can speak of conversion, of re-education as a means of dealing with the problem of a given population. But if race is fixed and responsible for behaviour and morality and so on, then eugenics and slaughter become mechanisms that are made to seem more necessary. And notions of fixity and biological determinism are largely 19th century constructions. That said, there is no need to take understandings of race in the period in which race science became normal science as entirely definitional of the concept. I do not, for example, think that the history of modern race begins in the 19th century either. For the 18th century, I would suggest the question should be rather broader. When did race become understood not as an effect, but as itself a cause? A comparison between classical and 19th century examples should make the distinction clear. In Hippocratic thought, physical differences were caused by climate and diet, by the airs, waters, and places in which people lived. Also produced by such environmental causes were forms of government, styles of behaviour, and systems of culture. Race, in other words, for the most part, did not cause differences in intellect or morality. It was itself an effect of environmental differences. In the 19th century, however, and I would argue a bit earlier, race became, as Robert Knox would infamously phrase it, destiny. Physical differences understood racially were taken to be the cause of mental differences. Africans had smaller brains, it was argued, and hence lower intellects. And the reason that this becomes useful is it means you can pull apart some debates, for example, about whether this is about race or, say, colour symbolism. So many of you will have seen there are images, for example, in the Middle Ages of demons who are cast as having black skin. And then the question we should ask, and why this becomes useful, are they black because they are evil, or are they evil because they are black? It's that second one that is racial talk in that 19th century determinist kind of way, and we can quickly split apart claims that I do not think are about race from the ones that really are. So then, when do we see the shift from race as effect to race as cause in medicine, for example? When does one begin to find arguments that related racialized physical differences to the presence or inclination to particular diseases in ways that saw them not as sharing a common cause, the environment, for example, but rather in ways that saw race as the cause of the affliction? Think of contemporary debates. Ashkenazi Jews have a higher than normal, higher than average tendency towards Tay-Sachs disease. It's a statistical claim, but nonetheless a causal claim about genetics, right? So we're seeing it today. As a historian, I'm in general nervous about giving a simple answer, but I'll still do it. We're all among friends here. The answer is around 1750. After around 1750 is when we see this shift to cause. And much of the detail of this talk then will be about the end of the 18th century. So that's race then. What about race science? So a major aim of my book is to offer a contribution towards and correction of much of the work done on the intellectual history, define that if you're interested, of naturalistic understandings of race. The seminal book, as I keep noting, was Steppen's The Idea of Race in Science, Great Britain 1800 to 1960. And in retrospect, it seems easy to situate Steppen's book at the centre of two complementary trends in early science studies. One of those sought to demonstrate the social, cultural, and political roots of seemingly objective ideas in contemporary science. We can think, for example, of a number of studies of Darwinian thought, the Foreman thesis, an array of works in feminist history and philosophy of science. The other trend sought to problematize demarcation criteria, pointing out the difficulties in differentiating methodologically between good science and so-called pseudoscience. This is the province of some early work in the sociology of scientific knowledge on spoon bending or parapsychology, for example, and also works by historians on subjects such as magic, alchemy, phrenology, and eugenics. So, science that was judged cranky and objectionable by today's standards was clearly not always regarded as such. And Steppen's book combines both of those arguments. On the one hand, she asserted, quote, the scientists who gave scientific racism its credibility and respectability were often first-rate scientists struggling to understand what appeared to them to be deeply puzzling problems of biology and human society. To dismiss their work as merely pseudo-scientific would mean missing an opportunity to explore something important about the nature of scientific inquiry itself. However troubling it may appear today, race science was good science done by scientists of excellent repute. And on the other hand, even the casual reader could not help but notice that Steppen placed Darwin at the centre of her work on dubious, culturally ridden science. So good science, by then contemporary standards, had produced ideas about racial fixity and racial limits, and discourses about fixity and inequality had helped shape good science by standards that we continue to accept. Now, it's also, however, in retrospect, that we can identify some of the problems induced by these historiographical and political aims of Steppen's study. The idea of race in science joined a growing body of scholarship interested in challenging current norms and ideals, and hence tended to emphasise the roots of those elements in the past. Steppen's was a study, for example, of race science, largely biology and ethnology, not of race medicine, in spite of the fact that many, if not most, early race scientists were trained as doctors. That's, of course, how you learned anatomy. James Cowles Pritchard, for example, was a Bristol physician. Robert Knox, an anatomist who left Edinburgh several years after his involvement in the Burke and Hare body snatching scandal. The medical grounding of much race science is particularly clear if one looks, as Steppen would in her next monograph, beyond the European metropole. The majority of those with scientific training in the colonies were medical men. Of course, who sends that many natural philosophers out to the colonies? But you need a lot of doctors and surgeons and so on. The metropolitan focus of the idea of race in science was, of course, a conscious choice. The best men of science were likely to be found in European capitals. Yet this meant that the study of race in science often concentrated on places with little contact between different races. These races, then in the metropole, were often represented by skulls and skeletons. So we know in general too little about the ways in which daily contact between races shaped taxonomic understanding. Beyond questions of collecting, our histories of the practices of race science often tend to avoid discussions of slavery and colonialism as quotidian experience. And then finally, Steppen was most interested in race science as normal science during the period in which biology came of age, was named, as a discipline in its own right. If seemingly misguided, the questions of race science are demonstrably part of the heritage of modern science. The methods are naturalistic, physical features are assumed to provide adequate guides to mental characteristics. Yet the origins of race science lie at least in the 18th century, and race as a category of analysis, as we see in many of the work here, has grown dramatically in importance in our genomic age. So the aim of my work in general is to relocate race along three axes: discipline, geography, and period. So that's the kind of structuring. Let me get into the stuff. 18th century race and medicine. I date the turn towards hardening conceptions of race as part of a response to the abolitionist movement beginning roughly in the 1760s. The effect of anti-slavery propaganda was to politicise the very question of natural equality. It was one thing to entertain the possibility in the abstract, John Wood Sweet has wryly observed. It was quite another to confront it as a political challenge to immensely profitable colonial plantation regimes. So the chapter from which I'm drawing this material explores the relationships between race, medicine, abolitionism and slavery in the second half of the 18th century. That chapter does three things. I'm only going to focus on one here. What I'm going to do and to explore are a number of the heterodox and racialist positions that were increasingly defining a real and significant minority in European conversations. So it should be noted, I'm talking about a minority position that's growing, not a majority position. I'm talking about heterodoxy. By 1780, I'll show, one can begin to locate precisely the sorts of arguments that had been absent in the first half of the 18th century. Arguments where medical logics and racial logics were combined, and where racialized physical differences were described as causing characteristically racial medical differences. At the end of the century, race medicine then was beginning to emerge. So, what was then the orthodox position so that we can define an opposition? The orthodox position associated the causes of illness with the Hippocratic triad of airs, waters and places rather than innate racial characteristics. But one can begin to see, as I say, a shift from the last decades of the century. The heterodox camp was still heterodox, but it was growing, with at least half a dozen writers from the mid-1770s to 1820 putting forward medical theories of the differences between black and white bodies. Such theories, I aim to show, can be divided according to the dominant medical logics of the day. Those up to around the mid-1780s tended to work within what I've called the putrefactive paradigm, stressing the ability of African skin to throw out the putrid matter that was so easily produced in warm climes. Dark skin was thus an advantage, but one that was put to work in defending the use of black enslaved labour in the colonies against the charges of abolitionists. From the late 1780s, putrefactive theories were increasingly replaced by the nervous theories most commonly associated with Haller and Cullen. Within the nervous paradigm, more emphasis was placed on the differential sensibility of black and white bodies. Moving inward, physicians found race to be more than skin deep and black bodies as less able to feel pain or discomfort for putatively physiological reasons. Now, to make clear that Hippocratism was orthodoxy, let me begin with a decidedly heterodox author, Edward Long, slave owner and polygenist. I do not say this lightly, but Edward Long was the most odious racist of the 18th century, and I'll stand by that and fight you if you want to disagree. This is the man who, of course, argued, he's a polygenist, that black and white people were different species. He argued that black people and white people, when they had children, those children would eventually be sterile. That is to say, he fully completed the analogy between mulatto and mule. He claimed that a Hottentot woman should find it as no dishonour to take an orangutan as a husband. He's as gross as can be and as fully racialist and racist as one can imagine. So it's super interesting then the way that he talks about disease. So, this is how he talks about diseases of the peoples of Jamaica. The natives, black and white, are not subject, like Europeans, to bilious, putrid and malignant fevers. They are not only habituated to the climate, but do a difference in respect of diet and manners, which works no small change in men's constitutions. A Creole, if he was to addict himself to that kind of diet, which is known to have a tendency to produce disorders or an acrid, corrupt bile, would be no more exempt from them than a European. So the split here is explicitly not about race. The discourse is about nativity. White and black Creoles are paired and juxtaposed together to newly arrived Europeans. But there is one place in his discussion, in his 1,500 pages of the history of Jamaica, where Long did aver to intrinsic physical differences between black and white bodies in a medical setting. And it came tellingly in a discussion about the relative capacity to labour in tropical climates, and it invoked Benjamin Franklin as its authority. Dr. Franklin very properly concludes, he noted, that the quicker evaporation of perspirable matter from the skin and lungs of Negroes, by cooling them more, enables them to bear the sun's heat so much better than the whites can do, though abstracted from this, the colour of their skins would otherwise make them more sensible of that heat. Now, the question here is why, given black cloth heats you up more in a hot sun and therefore should make you more uncomfortable, why doesn't black skin do the same thing? And the answer, of course, that is implied is it doesn't do the same thing. That's why it's okay to make black people work in the burning sun. And indeed, Franklin makes clear his awareness of the stakes of this question. If this is a fact, as it is said to be, he puts in parentheses, for the alleged necessity of having Negroes rather than whites to work in the West India fields is founded upon it. Now, Long had in fact invoked a more explicitly medicalised version of this argument earlier in the text, precisely to defend black slavery and simultaneously and characteristically taking the opportunity to critique slaves for their promiscuity. Negroes, he asserted, so far from suffering and inconvenience, are found to labour with most alacrity and ease to themselves in the very hottest part of the day. The openness of their pores gives a free transpiration to bad humours, and they would enjoy robust health under the hardest toils expedient there if they were less prone to debauch and venereal excess. Now, as Jordan observed in White Over Black so many years ago, the trope that held that black skin conferred advantages when labouring in warm climates was very common in the 18th century, but usually also, quote, formless and imprecise. One can see, however, that medical discussions formed one site for a general claim to acquire both form and precision. In 1780 and 82, the physician Johann Peter Schotter, whose weather diary detailed a year spent on the island of St. Louis in the River Senegal, made a similar claim. Their bodies are constitutionally better adapted to throw off this rank and noxious matter formed in the fluids by the outlets of the skin than the Europeans, and that it's for this reason that they are less subject to those putrid diseases which originate from its retention within the body. For it cannot be supposed that this noxious matter should be more copiously generated in their bodies than in those of Europeans, as they seem to be intended by nature to inhabit that country. This explanation also supplied a cause for another fact invoked casually but consistently in discussions of race from at least the mid-century onwards. The claim, as Kant would put it, that all Negroes stink. Stinken, it's very clear in the German. Schotter argued that the smell derived from sweat containing, quote, rancid and putrid particles, and that European perspiration also smelled bad in the humid months, though its feature is not to be compared to that of the blacks. The latter bathed regularly, he observed, so the odour could not be due to any nastiness harbouring on the surface of the skin. Instead, it must derive from the sweat itself, which did a better job in their bodies than in those of mulattoes or whites in removing toxic elements from their bodies. Now, Schotter would seem to have been flirting with polygenism, with his suggestion that nature had intended blacks to live in warm climates and hence had purposefully adapted their skin to aid them there. Alexander Wilson, who had studied under Cullen at Edinburgh, was not nearly so coy. In 1780, he made arguments that combined phlogiston theory, this is cutting-edge science, this race science, with claims about the cause of the blackness of skin, the capacity of such skin to keep its possessors healthier under the tropical sun, and the concomitant smell of phlogisticated sweat. Negroes, he wrote, seem a peculiar variety of the human species, better fitted by nature than those of fair complexions to discharge by the pores of the skin the phlogiston evolved from their bodies and consequently much better adapted to the warm climates. So between Long, Schotter and Wilson, we have three texts published within less than a decade of one another. The authors of each are very different. Long had no formal medical training. Schotter and Wilson are both physicians. Long was drawing on his experiences in the West Indies, Schotter from Senegal, Wilson from unspecified warm climates. Yet in terms of their claims, the similarities are abundant. All either explicitly or implicitly denied monogenist orthodoxy, all pointed to the black skin of those from Africa as a racial peculiarity, but all also seemed to suggest that the truly significant medical characteristic of black skin was not primarily its colour, but rather the protection it afforded its possessor in warm climates. And they identified that protection in the same way. Franklin had argued natural philosophically, so to speak, positing that dark skin allowed the easier passage of perspiration, which then evaporated on the outer surface of the skin. Long, Schotter, and Wilson, on the other hand, argued medically, stressing not the perspiration alone, but rather what it carried with it. Black skin allowed dangerous matter, bad humour for Longs, rancid and putrid particles for Schotter, phlogiston for Wilson, to be expelled from the bodies more easily than white skin, one side effect being the racialised smell supposedly typical of Negroes. The three also held in common what they did not argue. Race did not make much of a difference in susceptibility to the vast majority of diseases, and where blacks might suffer disproportionately rather than be protected, the cause was never innate. Now, of course, we should not be misled or confused by claims that suggested black superiority on any issue, particularly not when such arguments were made by those making the claim that all humans were not of the same species. The ability to function better than whites meant fundamentally the ability to labour better than whites. This was medicine either explicitly or implicitly in defence of unfreedom. So let us now turn to racialised medicine under a different paradigm. Benjamin Moseley was one of the first writers on the diseases of warm climates to turn against the putrefactive theory. In Moseley's hands, the distinction between the irritable and the sensible parts of animals became a racial trait. His treatise on tropical diseases, 1787, the first text in English to include the term tropical diseases, tended not to discuss the afflictions of the enslaved population in any detail, but in considering tetanus, he drew a number of observations together. The locked jaw, he asserted, was as a disease entirely of irritability and not of sensibility, meaning it affected only the muscles and not the nerves. Negroes, he observed, as had medical men before him, were particularly subject to the disease, and Negroes, he continued, whatever the cause may be, are void of sensibility to a surprising degree. They are not subject to nervous diseases. They sleep sound in every disease, nor does any mental disturbance ever keep them awake. In a claim that continues to the present day, they bear surgical operations much better than white people. This is reproduced in medical texts today. And what would be the cause of insupportable pain to a white man, a Negro would almost disregard. Now, it doesn't take a cynical reader I am a cynical reader, but still, you don't have to be, to suspect that Moseley's interest in reporting his beliefs on black insensitivity to pain and suffering, however firmly believed, might be related to criticisms levelled by abolitionists against planters and their harsh treatment of the enslaved. Now, if Moseley was somewhat vague about the precise connections between race and susceptibility to disease, one Dr. Collins was clearer. In many portions of a text from 1811, Collins followed the dietetic and environmentalist logics I've noted were the orthodox position. Elsewhere, however, he would add a further, seemingly fixed and innatist distinction. Besides, there are many striking variations between the temperament of the whites and those of the Negroes, sufficient almost to induce a belief of a different organisation, which the knife of the anatomist, however, has never been able to detect. Now, the first of these should be familiar. Levels of heat that were intolerable to whites were pleasant and even necessary to the Negro. Collins rejected utterly the claims of abolitionists that the fields of the West Indies could be worked by free men, whether white or black. Not only slavery, but specifically black slavery, he argued, was an economic and physical necessity. But in addition, racial difference had a therapeutic corollary. Neither nauseous drugs nor blisters had the effects on black bodies that they did on whites. There's reason to think, he concluded, that the sensibilities both of their minds and bodies are much less exquisite than our own. Travelling the same road as Moseley, he added, they are able to endure, with few expressions of pain, the accidents of nature which agonise white people. Yet where Moseley left the matter there, Collins offered an explanation. It's difficult to account for this otherwise than by supposing, which probably is the case, that animal sufferings derive a great part of their activity from the operations of the intellect. The power of such a set of claims should be clear. On the one hand, Collins could stand with the orthodox when discussing disease causation, relating it to dietetic, behavioural and environmental factors. There were no diseases, he acknowledged, peculiar to either constitution, which may not be entertained by both. Differences were a matter of degree and not of kind. But on the other hand, he could still deploy racialist and essentialist arguments that denigrated the intellectual and emotional capacities of black people. Such arguments required, clearly, no concrete anatomical evidence, since they were apparently undetectable by the knife of the anatomist, but they had palpable effects in terms of the day-to-day practice of medicine. It will be observed, he wrote, that in the treatment of Negro disorders, I have frequently departed from the rules laid down by European practitioners, and that has been done as well from a regard to the peculiarities of their constitutions as to their general habits of life, which neither require nor admit of the refinement practiced with respect to white patients. Many physicians had simply taken it for granted that black and white patients would be treated differently. With Collins, one finds an attempt at a justification for this rooted not just in the brute social and economic realities of a slave system, but in the seemingly intangible but essential physiological peculiarities of the races. Okay, I'm out of time. I'm going to take 2 minutes and conclude very quickly. By the 1770s, a number of authors were beginning to question the extent to which climate, diet, or behaviour could explain all of the characteristic features of the peoples of the world. The doctrine of special creations remained heterodoxy, although less heterodox than earlier, but race was hardening as a concept. Medicine, I'd suggest, played a not insubstantial role in this hardening, but it did so in ways that were not straightforward. In more heterodox accounts, one finds a blending of anatomical conceptions of race, rooted in the skin, for example, with medical paradigms, the combination working to affirm the interests of planters and those who participated in the man trade. General assertions about the capacity of Africans and their descendants to labour in conditions deadly to Europeans were given a medical extension. Black skin not only cooled when it should have warmed, but it also encouraged the removal of the putrefactive elements that built up within the body in hot and humid conditions. As putrefactive theories waned in the last decades of the century, medical apologists argued for other innate physical differences between blacks and whites, rooting these in the nervous system and arguing that withholding from slaves the kinds of careful and sensitive treatment that would be standard for Europeans was not merely an economic decision, but one based on physiological differences. Now, whether heterodox or not, medicine and racialized forms of difference were clearly complexly intertwined, and that complexity is part of the value of the topic. I've long been struck by a sentence in Blumenbach's seminal dissertation from the mid-1770s at the moment when he turned away from a focus on skin towards skulls. I intend now to treat a little more at length, he wrote, upon that part of the argument which has to do with skulls, since things very nearly allied may be conveniently embraced and handled at the same time. The things of the sentence here would seem to include not only conceptual matters, political concepts, but the objects themselves. In the quiet of a study, the natural historian might handle and compare solid representations of racial variety. Precisely this was denied to the student of race medicine. Skulls might be considered immutable mobiles, diseases most certainly were not. Moreover, for the historian trying to reconstruct the logics behind the studies of diseases in situ, the contexts of colonialism and slavery are unavoidable. Racial difference, whether rooted in a nominally changeable set of dietetic or cultural practices, or bred in the skin, bones and nerves, increasingly shaped the interactions between medical men and their patients, and in turn, forms of medical knowledge increasingly shaped the course of colonialism and abolition. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we have, let's see, until 4:30. So that's almost an hour, 50 minutes. Questions? Yeah, Chen?
So my question's for Suman. It makes a lot of sense to me. This is a fascinating talk, and it makes a lot of sense to me to shift to the periphery.
Yeah.
But of course, there's more than one peripheral place that one could think about. And so I want to ask you about the specificity of the West Indies.
Yeah.
And I can think of a couple of things. Of course, slavery, plantation slavery. Also, possibly yellow fever, a disease that has a very particular kind of, where catastrophic effects for people who are not immune. Once you have immunity, you're okay. And I wonder if you could contrast that with the Indian case. And I'm thinking of, like, my reading of like Mark Harrison, David Arnold, is I have the sense that there's a slightly different periodization possibly, that it's a bit later where this kind of hard race theory comes in. And if there's a way to explain that by geographical and economic differences between those two, or in some other way. And how you would then start to tell us a story about race science or race theory that would incorporate multiple parts of the periphery.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's actually, I try and answer that concretely in my third chapter. So a big chunk of what I'm interested in is the history of the concept of seasoning. So the question is basically, there's two questions. Why do you get sick when you go from, say, London to Jamaica? And then two, if you survive that sickness, why do you never get quite that sick again? And the answer given is that you've become seasoned to the climate. I can go through the etymology, it is indeed. But if you've ever seasoned a wok, that's the word, right? And part of what I do in that third chapter is look at that language of seasoning throughout the British Empire as a way of giving a mapping of the imaginative geography of the British Empire in terms of degrees of difference of all of those parts. The logic being, or the question being, how severe is the seasoning in all of those different parts, right? And the answer is, for India, not nearly as severe as, say, West Africa. And so you get this claim, which is substantiated in lots of places, that India is not as different to Europe as, say, West Africa is, where part of the claim is that you cannot become seasoned, it's too much, or the West Indies, where the level of seasoning is incredibly profound. So that's one set of differences. I actually think Harrison changes his mind after Climates and Constitutions. That's 1999, and he writes it on India. He's got a book on medicine in the age of commerce and empire 2010, and he backdates, precisely because he starts looking at the West Indies rather than just India, he backdates where the hardening happens. But I do agree with him that the really hard hardening, we've got a beginning right around the time that race science is emerging, 1770s, 1780s, as a response to abolitionism. But the really, really hard stuff, 1830s, Harrison has an argument that's specific to India. I actually think a better argument, as part of what I'm working on now, is that it's probably British abolitionism, right? So we've long known that after the Civil War in the US, that racialism becomes as stark as it really does. It's much worse after 1865 than before, and I think precisely the same kind of thing is happening after 1833. But it's worth noting, within that date, Knox is 1850. So Knox is taken as a starting point, and the backdating, I think, is probably the 1830s, but it's already happening in medicine.
Kaushik?
Thanks. This is for Banu, and thank you for that paper. I appreciated it very much, and I appreciated the sort of nature, culture, thinking, diaspora, diaspora together in an age of xenophobia. But I wanted to complicate that along 4 axes, because it seemed like a lot of the discourse that you were tracing was around the native alien binary, right? And so I was thinking of 4 complications that might be structural complications. The first is that the native of the native/alien binary that prevails in this discourse is in fact not the native but the settler, right? So how does one think of the valorization of the native in this discourse in the aftermath of actual native genocide, right? The second is that, of course, the constitutional and political-cultural history of the US is marked by xenophobia, but it's also marked by moments of extreme xenophilia. And, of course, some of that is paternalist and exceptionalist and so on, but there's also a true cosmopolitan history to the country as well. And so when you put those xenophilic ideas of nature up, like I was wondering how one thinks those in relation to histories of cosmopolitanism in the US. Like, are those exceptions or reactions to a xenophobic foundation, or in fact is there something that's much more fluid and relational at stake? The third is that this sort of element of xenophilia is a function, at least in part, of this whole myth of America being a nation of immigrants. But Julie Chu has been doing work where she shows that the category of immigrant only emerged in the 1880s, and after the end of slavery. And before that, the relevant category was the settler. There was no such notion of the immigrant. So it seems like the sort of native/alien is in fact triangulated by a relationship between native, settler, and immigrant. And how do we think about that triangulation? And finally, the sort of, if one thinks of this story in terms of histories of settler colonialism rather than presence of immigration, then one thing that both actual natives and actual plants had an intimate relationship to was the land. And so of course there's also a story of dispossession here. And I'm wondering how one thinks the place of property in the diaspora relationship.
All great questions. So in part, this work really, for me, comes as an experimental biologist trying to think about doing biology today. And so to some extent, I think the history I presented stops at a particular place. And so within botany, there is, I don't know that anyone has studied why some things are called native and some things are called naturalized. So these definitions are a bit murky if you actually look at the history. So there isn't, in my opinion, a precise definition of why different things are called. So I think there's a complicated history to be told there of why botanists call some things native. And so that parallel between sort of settler colonialism and the kind of cosmopolitanism you're talking about is a little more murky. And I don't know of anyone who's gone. And to some extent, what you would need to do is really go, it's a sociological project of interviewing biologists, say, what do you think this is? And I don't know to what degree all biologists would agree that some things are native, some things are naturalized, sort of these kinds of definitions. And so it's in part an empirical project to me, sort of what that histories are. With respect to, what was the second? About the xenophilia, in part, I presented that precisely because of, of making the argument that there are these nature cultural arguments to be made, that part of what's happening culturally parallels the ways in which we think about plants and animals. And so with the beginning of the immigrant, of the ways in which we start treating things called foreign. So, and finally, this question of land and properties, I want to answer in two ways. One is, one of the striking things when you look at moves to, pull out foreign plants and plant native plants, often these, they do these public campaigns and weekends, we can all sacrifice our weekends and go do this. But a lot of it sort of pretends there's no land, right? There's no soil, that there's no relationship between plants and soil communities. And so I've been collaborating with two ecologists where we did a series of experiments looking at native and foreign plants and soil communities. And really these categories don't work as monolithic categories. That the relationships of different native plants with soil communities and different foreign plants develop very different relationships. Some of them have little relationships with it, right? And some over time develop either coevolutionary or sometimes there are parasitic and pathogenic organisms. So part of sort of what these colleagues in part call for is that when we are thinking about native and foreign plants, so if we are trying to do a project of restoration, what also matters is the land, right? And the soil and the histories of those land with the people there. And so partly I feel the ways in which we think about human diasporas and the complexity with which we talk about the social there could be much benefit in beginning to think about the natural context with that complexity of the social. And similarly, the ways in which we talk about the social can learn a bit more about the kind of natural histories that have emerged.
Okay, so Tapati had a question. Do you want to grab a microphone?
My question's for your paper, which I really enjoyed. But I was trying to understand, and I think this is connected to the earlier question. You mentioned this early period of empire, where plants are among the most widely trafficked and circulating kind of specimens. And you have, therefore, the production of new kinds of landscapes which are being produced in areas, in settler colonies, in colonized areas, and similarly, plants from the tropical worlds traveling back and being kind of almost domesticated in new kinds of climates and places. So if you think of that kind of botanical empire and the travels and trafficking of botanic specimens, it's hugely wide. But then you jump to a different scenario of invasion biology, where suddenly the question of alien plants and alien specimens become objects of threat, danger. So I was trying to understand that shift. And you, of course, very productively, you linked it with the specter of immigration, so that, in a way, it's both about, where human and both plants kind of immigration. But I'm trying to understand when this shift occurs. And why this kind of suddenly, why is there this entire positioning against the coming in of the plants as aliens?
I think that's precisely why I am perplexed by this history as well, right? About the ways in which we can talk about contemporary invasion biology and immigration and what has happened to plants and animals as though there is no history before. And so to me also, I see a kind of disjuncture here. And really shift and perhaps that shift is what you're talking about, of the emergence of the category of the immigrant, which is a different kind of category than existed before. But to me, it seems like a hubris of empire. It's like, when it suited the colonists, it was fine to take things around, introduce crops in countries that didn't exist. But at the same time, when during a different political movement, then the borders get closed. And there is a kind of surveilling and quarantining and then abolition of certain kinds of plants.
But if at one time the plants could so easily be made adaptable to different climates
That's
and
not
cultures.
always, okay, so I was making that a little simpler than the history would suggest. In fact, there are some plants that did not take, that were not transportable. And in order to find the right plantation crops, sometimes there were a lot of experiments to figure out, what was adaptable or not. So I'm sort of writing a very complex history of how colonial botany functioned. And it was not necessarily, easy that any plant would do anything. And I think colonial botanists discovered that soon. And so partly colonial botany is about trying to figure out why some things take, why things don't, what can be transported, what cannot.
Yeah, tea, I think, would be one good example. Yeah. So I have a quick follow-up myself, actually, and then Mara has a question. But I'm curious if you've looked at or thought about looking at how some of these debates maybe not these debates, but analogous debates around migration play out in evolutionary biology, especially thinking about population genetics in the early 20th century, so Sewell Wright, for example, but also earlier kind of theories about the role of migration, especially in speciation in the late 19th century, where migration and also hybridization there were debates about this, but were often thought to be very productive for the creation of novelty through speciation.
So to my memory, if you think of Sewell Wright and sort of that period, it's far more recent, right? And a lot of those are also on experiments. So I think it's a very different picture. And I don't know a lot of colonialism and the histories of empire that enter into that thinking. There are other kinds of questions about variation and diversity and difference that emerge into the political debates of that time, but not quite these kinds of questions.
Yeah, Mara?
This is also a really small follow-up, but I mean very small. I was just wondering how theories of succession fit in. Like, are there like orderly ways of modes of species replacement or space sharing, even in a disturbed environment? And then are there like catastrophic invasions? Yeah. So that's
And I think this is, precisely what alarms some people, that when the early succession plans are, shift. So it's developing a different landscape, and so those older narratives of what happens with ecological systems get utterly transformed, right? So yes, it utterly does change that, because there is a sequence to how succession works. Yeah.
This is also for Banu. This might be a distraction, in which case ignore it, but I was intrigued by your comment about wanting to do experimental biology. So there are some plant biologists and ecologists who are describing plants as sort of the master organizers. The plants are so smart, they have cognitive capacities, they reorganize the soil. They say things like, these are heterodox plant biologists who will say things like, if we went away, the plants wouldn't care, but if the plants went away, we'd be totally screwed. So they're still thinking in imperial terms, but it's sort of the friendly empire of plants. So I guess my question is, how would you practice an ecology or an experimental biology that is anti-imperial and that is not, or maybe you are aligned with the group I just described, I don't know, but how would you, if you were to practice a different kind of science experimentally, what would it look like? Would it be in a lab at all?
I am not part of the group you talk about. So this is, sort of early stages of this project, and I think I would think of I'm thinking of the project more as decolonizing botany rather than about anti-imperialism. And in part, how I'm thinking about it is thinking conceptually of the field and the frameworks of the field. So for example, if you think of categories of sex and gender, so we talk about sex and gender in plants, we talk about sexuality in plants, we talk about male plants and female plants. And so it comes from a history where plants have really been sexualized, and often a Victorian sexuality that's been imposed on them. And yet, if you look at what flowering plants do, it's incredible. And so we have had to produce so many new terms that explain, it's like 1 wife, 8 husbands, 10 wives, 1 husband, all because plants do something very different. And so I'm sort of interested in developing a different kind of conceptual that's not caught up in this kind of binary form of it. And more because I think within contemporary biology, we have new understandings of the importance of lateral evolution, so that we don't have to just talk about sexual reproduction and vertical vertical modes of inheritance. So I think it allows for different kinds of conceptual landscapes that's not caught up in these kind of, sort of Victorian sexuality, or rethinking the tree of life, which is very caught up in questions of class, and how, sort of familial class interests, and thinking of other modes by which we might think of classification. So that's some of the places I'm going.
A question for Suman and then for Banu. First, just for clarification, do you distinguish, or how do you distinguish between racial science and racism? Where the distinction comes? I'm just now about your distinction between cause and effect, race as a cause, race as an effect. If we think from the point of view of the way people are treated, and we see that they are treated differently, there is a differential system of ruling, is it possible, was it the case, and what is the importance, if this is the case, that people were treated differently just because of the effect, without the race considered as a cause? I suspect that they were. I have a suspicion that even before this shift, which I think is very important, they were treated differently. So if this is the case, if we have enough cases like this, then what is the importance of, what is the role of racial science, race science, in the emergence of racial regimes?
Yeah, no, it goes straight to the stakes here. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I got excited.
And the question for Banu is inspired by a good friend of mine, a Palestinian intellectual, who several years ago introduced a very interesting question that was at one of the same time a challenge to his Jewish friend, but also to the Palestinian community in Israel. Rieppel is his name. He asked the question, when does a settler become a native? Now, I would like to ask something similar about plants and about, so what are the conditions in which you would consider these migrants, not immigrants, migrants, plants, natives? There are, again, I would like to take the example from Palestine. At a certain point in the history of the colonization of Palestine by the Zionists, either Zionists or British, I don't know exactly who, brought eucalypts, you say eucalyptus?
Eucalyptus.
From Australia to Palestine. And they're all over the place now. People of my generation and younger people grew up with eucalypts as significant marks of the Israeli natural landscape. So to think that these are migrants, or these are, it's very strange. So this is this.
You go first? Oh, great. Yeah, so super interesting. Racism versus race science. Part of it is simply just getting at a discursive register for talking about physical differences and their importance. So when I say race science, I tend to mean discourses by those trained within the sciences of some kind and invoking explicitly naturalistic arguments to make their claims of bigotry, which we can, of course, in lots of everyday situations where we would identify racism, we would note that the bigot is not invoking some kind of naturalistic explanation for their bigotry, they're just laying out their bigotry. So it can be And it is, to me, a distinction between the kinds of people who are making the claims and the kinds of claims being made. So it's as simple as that, I think. Now, this question of whether one gets racist prejudice before race is seen as the cause of the thing that you're discriminating against someone on the basis of. This is indeed, as you probably know, this is actually discussed in some detail in the literature. One of the central questions, for example, is the question of whether anti-Judaism is actually anti-Semitism. For many of the medieval cases that we look at, it's not. It tends to be anti-Judaism and concentrated less on physical features than it is on forms of behaviour. One of the few places where we seem to have crossovers is in cases of conversions, where it's claimed, so conversions from Judaism to Christianity, where some, in particular settings, politically rife, make the claim that even after that complete conversion, there is some essence that remains that justifies forms of bigotry. But, honestly, I've tried to now read consistently across much of the early modern and medieval period. Certainly for the classical period, I don't think I see it. I don't see, despite colour prejudice, so colour symbolism, much evidence that tracks its way across to lower treatment on the basis of skin colour or something like it. Even in something like, this is the classic example that literature people point to, Othello, right? There are claims about skin colour in there. A lot of the claims are about religion, at least kind of indirectly, about him being a Moor. I think your question are about the stakes, though, right? Less than, as much as the empirical question, the next question is, what difference does it make? If bigotry is the result, why do we care? Is that part of the question?
No, not why do
No?
you care, but what is the significance of the discursive shift in creating the forms of discrimination and the racial regime, the racial political regime?
Okay, so that question is, it's absolutely crucial when the state gets involved, which explanation you're using, right? Because it leads to radically different state interventions. In one of them, conversion, forced and violent, is a possibility. In another one, you give up on the possibility of conversion because it's never possible, and you get other options, and indeed, the argument is even more horrific options of state violence follow from one than the other. So that's where the stakes are in that question, and I think it really is, you need to move away from individual acts of violence to that modernist intervention of the state and its actions on those forms of explanation.
It's a great question, and in short, it's what brings me here is that it's a political question, that there aren't any biological categories by which that happens. So clearly, with respect to humans in this country, that's quite an invention of how the white settlers are now the natives who sort of make the rules. And so with respect to plants, so there are so many different case studies. So I have a collaboration with literary critic Karen Cardozo, where we're looking at Asian American nature cultures, in looking at the ways in which we talk about the immigration of humans versus different plants and animals that get openly labeled as Asian. And it's a sort of complicated story. And I think there are other kinds of stories about nature cultures that are identified from other places of the world just because these genealogies and histories are so different. There are also co-evolutionary stories here where a so-called foreign plant has come, but a native butterfly now treats that as a host. And so then the question becomes, do we pull this foreign plant out, or is it now part of, a relationship, with native plants? And then I think most closely these altercations come in restoration biology, where people are trying to restore the plants to some idea of the native before. And this is always the question, is that 50 years, 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years? You know, who decides what is native? And some of these restoration ecological projects, you've never seen so many chemicals. Right, so part of how you restore to a native past is by herbicides and pesticides and chemically bombing the area into some mythic past. And then there have also been altercations of sort of places where restoration biologists want to, it's somewhere in the Midwest, want to restore prairie. And there are these beautiful, streets with trees that people have lived with all their lives. And then they say, we want to cut down these trees and, restore, the original prairie here. And people say, no, we like our trees. So I think there are lots of very complicated stories by which these questions are being mediated. And I don't know that there's any one.
Stereophonic. It's a quick question for both of you. Banu, a slightly illiterate question. I was very...
I severely doubt that.
No. I was really very taken by your sort of astonishing opening thoughts on taxonomy. And I realize your critique of naming central to taxonomy as this gesture of imperial erasure. I was wondering what you had to say about the way taxonomy partakes also of systems of resemblance, and about the endurance of taxonomy as a form of imperial natural thinking. Simply because systems of resemblance, and I have Foucault's order of things at the back of my mind, are anachronistic, inadequately modern. So there is a way in which, in order to do the colonial act of naming and erasure, the natural historian has to participate long after it's fashionable in an epistemology of resemblance and similitude rather than representation and difference. So I just wondered what you had to say about that. I look forward to learning because it's something I'm interested in. Suman, again, forgive this question. It's a question about style. It was very passionate, everything you said, but I wondered about a general question, really, for those here who work on racism and racial science. It's an old problem in post-colonial thinking, which is Malek Alula's colonial harem. The reproduction of pornographic photographs of Algerian women, and whether that reproduction is a sort of perpetuation. It's simply, you must be asked this question, and it's something you must face because you rely on citation. And it's a complex experience, listening to the critique while encountering the reproduction. So I wonder how you deal with the ethics of the very important work you do.
That's a really, really great question. And I think for me, I got introduced to the politics of naming just because growing up in India plants are so caught up in mythological stories. So very often plants, and in fact their morphologies are caught up in, some of them wonderful, And so then when you go to school, then you're forced to learn by rote these Latin names, and every now and then there'll be a name that you recognize because it's also in the language you learn. So Kincaid really speaks to me in terms of that kind of violence, right? That you have to unlearn things and then have to learn in this foreign tongue, a completely new, and that continues forever, right? I mean, for the rest, if you're in the field of botany, that's the language you continue on. But in thinking about the sort of technologies of knowing and of classification, they've since shifted to questions of molecular, right, of looking at evolutionary trees through genetics, and there's a lot of debate within the field of what, whether ultimately the morphological things of how much do we look at the phenotype and morphology as a way to think about it, or the degree to which we should be looking at the molecular evolution, because sometimes you see very different unrelated organisms have the same morphology, or sometimes very related organisms do something very different. So both kinds of evolution are mixed up in different plant systems. So this, to some extent, is a philosophical question for the field of, and there's a lot of debate in the field of what one should do.
Yeah, I do get asked this question a lot, of course. I mean, the most basic answer, but it's the one I think you already know, so feel free to ask again if I don't properly answer. We need to understand exactly what they thought. That's a political aim. There's no way that we're going to counter these discourses if we approach them, as so many of my students do at the beginning, as simply understanding them as mindless forms of instrumentalist grasping for power, right? That is not how racism or colonialism worked. It's not how the civilizing mission worked. People believed these things, they made sense to them, and it's our job to reconstruct the logics, and then the political aim is so that we can counter them effectively when we see equivalent or similar kinds of versions. So that's the easy answer that you already know. Why do I include the quotes? That's then, I think, an ethics of we all. It's not just me who has to understand them. We all, if I'm presenting it to you, we all have to understand it and work through it with one another. I think that I apply the same method, when I'm reading Kant as when I'm reading Edward Long. I don't see why I would have a different method if the same aim is there, which is to understand Kant in his terms and by his logics. And yes, of course, and then the standard one. We should always remember how horrific the shit is and be forced to face it down because sugarcoating it misses the point. Lots of people would like to avoid the horribleness of race discourse. I don't think that they should be allowed, because when they're allowed, they downplay the horribleness of racism and tell us it wasn't that bad and people didn't suffer so much and so on and so forth. So, yes, simplistic, I guess, but that's the ethics for me.
Stephanie?
Actually, something really strange and uncanny has happened, that sitting in such close proximity to Leela, she actually asked not just one, but both of the questions. I too had in mind people like Britt Besser to insist on analyzing sort of racist imagery in science without reproducing and increasing their circulation. And I take your answer, but I also am troubled methodologically by the need to reproduce and possibly with it. I mean, so many forms of critique serve to reinforce the thing that they critique, and there's always that risk. But I think you're right and I'm wrong, but it's helpful to hear your answer. And my question for you, Banu, is just a less thoughtful version of the question that Leela just asked you, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I was very struck by your quotation about the fact that naming is ownership and renaming is murder, because of its ontological implications, that it's not just the scientific work of taxonomy that's at stake in this story that you're telling, but possibly what things are, or not possibly, but maybe obviously what things are is at stake in your story. And I just wondered, I would just love to hear you talk explicitly about the ontological dimension of this project. Are things different things when they are experienced through the lens of these imperial taxonomies? Is eucalyptus different when it grows one place or another place? To what degree is the ontology of plant life part of what you are wanting to both make relational and destabilize in your story. And I also wanted to mention, I don't know, maybe you have encountered it, Stefan Helmreich, the anthropologist, has a really cool article. Do you know this piece?
Which one?
Oh,
Yes,
it's
many
called
cool
it's called How Scientists Think About Natives, for example,
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
taxonomy in
Yeah.
Hawaii, which is precisely an ethnography of how
Yep.
marine biologists categorize invasive species and native species, where those are such charged, I'm sure, political categories. I don't think what he's doing captures a fraction of what your story is about, but I was made to think of it.
Yeah, I would say absolutely. I think thinking nature culturally, one would say these are different objects, and evoking Kincaid, she has this wonderful story of having had to learn the poem Daffodil, right? And then when, of course, she'd never seen a daffodil, and when she finally saw a field of daffodils, she wanted to go and pull every single one out of there, right? Because of the kind of violence it had done, forcing her to study this thing she had never seen, and then it comes up in exams. And so this is such a common colonial story about wanting things and studying things you've never experienced, but it is taught to you in the name of education or being a more enlightened person. So I think those kinds of contexts are really important to talk about how the field of botany emerged, and then how we reproduce that violence. I mean, like, this is the botany I studied growing up in post-colonial India, right? So about that violence that continues to be produced generation after generation. And so similarly, something like eucalyptus, which we also have in India, has a slightly different but similar story about what existed before and how eucalyptus changed the political economies of many regions of India. So yeah.
So, I too have nostalgic memories of the smell of eucalyptus from my childhood in California, so maybe eucalyptus is the infrastructure of a cosmopolitanism, I don't know. My question actually is a follow-up on Leela's comment, and I'm not sure it's either new or I totally believe it, but somehow it seems valid, so I want to say it. And that maybe the problem with reproducing racist passages is not the racist passages themselves, because as you say, we need to look at things with open eyes to know how terrible they truly were, but that presenting only the voices of racist slaveholders reproduces a relationship of domination and oppression. So the solution would not be to censor those racist voices, but to complement them, displace them by the voices of enslaved people, abolitionists, people resisting or offering alternatives at the time. So, what do you think?
On the one hand, yeah, I do that, but I also, I think there's value in reconstructing precisely that relationship of dominance. I think that's a perfectly valid topic on its own, kind of full stop, and so that's okay, right? That's what we do. That's a topic. There are other topics. I mean, I do particularly, that's a European history, so it is abolitionists rather than the voices of slaves that make it into the book. The other argument, I guess I'm not satisfied with that as a solution, because we don't always have to do everything. But one quick thing to Steph is that I think that there's within this there's the broad answer that can apply in many fields. There's also a specifically science studies answer to this, which is about the stakes of our field, which is that I and many others want to argue that precisely, and we need to prove this, precisely the same formulations produce horrific science as produce science that we agree with, which means that we have to get right into the details and use exactly the same arguments symmetrically that we always would. So I do have to treat Kant and Edward Long the same way, or Buffon, or whatever, the same way. And that just as we would have quotes from Buffon to lay out an argument, we would also do this in these other fields. So I don't know how I mean, we can throw it out as a methodological question. How do I do the close readings and demonstrate that I'm doing them right to an audience that wants to see them the same way for Edward Long that I did for Arnold Sommerfeld? Because I don't think I've changed my method, right? How do I prove it for Long without using the methods that I did for Sommerfeld? Right? That's, I guess, the challenge for me, given that specifically science studies stake, which is showing equivalence in method, if not content, between two different things for specifically political aims, which our field has. Right?
Okay, so there's 5 minutes left. Joanna.
Wander in to this morass just because it's really interesting, and I feel like this is a moment when we're getting to some of the stakes of, I don't know, the way you invoked Suman proof in response to Steph's question, and Steph being an expert on the sort of the way that proof works, right? I guess I wanted to sort of ask about, what the question for me in science studies isn't so much like, do we make a symmetrical analysis, but like, can we show what it means to be a reliable knower? And I think I want to hear what Steph might say vis-a-vis proof, but I also think about getting out of our own disciplinary way to imagine if combating racism, which is something I think most of us, all of us in this room are interested in doing, is there a way in which this different infrastructures of our kind of cosmopolitan intellectual communities are hindering us from, our desire to want to, show proof? Because I feel like I have struggled with this in writing about indigeneity. It's like, well, where are the indigenous voices? And in some sense, it's, not possible or desirable to recover them, to force them to have to speak in a particular kind of way, which is another sort of challenge. And so I guess I just wonder about what this kind of a conversation, a very productive conversation, might lead us to want to do in thinking about the norms of what makes a reliable account for you in your underlying political project, clearly so evident political project of contesting racism in contemporary life and medicine and all of these things.
Can I say a one-word follow-up to that? I just wanted to say that the conversation made me think about the person, I don't remember his name, at the end of Iris's talk, the guy who gave the lecture about the teleologies of truth versus social justice. I mean, I wonder what he would think about the structure of the debate. Just a question.
So I wasn't going to say anything more, but I guess to sort of respond to Joanna, I do think there's a real danger in sort of deference to some formal method, that if we just apply it to all of our subjects of study in the same way, we will arrive at the correct answer. I mean, that is a deeply sort of logicist, vision of our own knowledge production, that at least it doesn't resonate with me, because I actually do employ very different methodologies and have access to very different sources for very different people. So, for example, when the people I study were under surveillance by the FBI, I filed Freedom of Information Act requests and got way more personal and private information about them than I have for anyone else. For the others, all of my sources come from sort of government-sanctioned, Department of Defense funded, like technical reports, sort of recognizing that our sources are not all equal, and the political stakes of their lives and the records they've left behind are not equal. And I don't actually think that Kant and your racist scientists are equal. It's sort of, the power differences are present in the texts and in the legacies and in the sources, and I sort of, at least for my own part, don't see myself as applying a constant method to all the different sources. I try or seek to sort of meet the political specificity of each of my sources and how they came to be. And I fear we do risk reproducing some kind of very reductive vision of knowledge production, which is I apply the method to the sources and get proof of my knowledge claims, which is precisely the vision of knowledge production that I'm seeking to dismantle in my book, because that's not what mathematicians do either, or logicians, or, you know, I guess, yeah, I guess I'm troubled, and I'm not saying that I don't think you should do precisely what you're doing, but I actually don't also think this is about social justice versus truth. I think that's a false dichotomy in so many ways, but I also think that doing work that does not reproduce violent regimes of knowledge production and circulation is not a social justice aim, it's a knowledge aim. It's like that's part of what we're here to do, it seems to me, I guess.
I mean, I didn't, sorry if I misspoke, I didn't think I was saying it, but I certainly don't think that it's a one-size-fits-all methodological move across the field. A lot of what I was trying to say is that I'm trying, at least in part, to reveal that my actors deploy similar methods. Part of this is like a general, I mean, it's a fight that is standard within the history of race, which is to try and make race a pseudoscience. And the way to do it is then to claim that it's methodologically different from,
yeah, no,
right?
Suman, I heard that part of what you said, and I think that's exactly right. And of course, that's part of what we're here to do. It's so much more powerful to explain why people thought what they thought and what the mechanics of their knowledge were, than just to dismiss them and ignore them. But you also said, like, I do with these texts and these voices the same close reading and presentation that I do with Kant. That was the part of the methodological sort of leveling of your own that you proposed that I was responding to. But of course, the project of showing like where all knowledge comes from is what we're here to do.
I mean, but there are ways in which, I mean, this is where it gets funky, is that nowadays, someone like Edward Long is actually of vastly lower status than someone like Arnold Sommerfeld, right? That these are now, many of the people I study were, of course, horrific racists who many people have forgotten about. So a lot of, as you know, a lot about science studies which did use symmetry of method was, in a sense, trying to raise the status of people who were dismissed, parapsychologists, spoonbenders, and so on. It became a, you know, there's a lot of debates about the politics of that. But again, like particularly in that, when I say I use the same method for like Sommerfeld as these mostly forgotten racist doctors, I am again engaging in the kinds of methods that we did in science studies for these reasons, to make meaningful and to prove that there were logics in there. So that's why the symmetry. But you're not buying, you buy that argument, but it's not what you're saying.
No, I mean, I'm just still troubled. I'm troubled. You don't seem troubled, but I'm troubled.
You know, the other thing here is it's not obvious to me that white nationalists are going to go find Alexander Wilson and spread his arguments around. I mean, I do think that there's a difference between 18th century sources and 21st century sources, or some of the pornographic images that, you know, I guess I don't have the fear that Nazis will find their way to these doctors and my quotes and deploy them in particular ways, precisely because these people have been dismissed by contemporary science for the beliefs that they had. Humoral theory is no longer supported. So there's also that as a thing that I'm not troubled by. I don't see it happening.
Okay, so let's thank both of our speakers.